Thank you. So this is joint work with my colleagues Joel Wilf and Josie Priest, Joy Priest. Joy Priest was a summer student with us from Rochester Institute of Technology and did a great job. Okay, so first some acknowledgements. This is work within JPL's Cyber Defense Research Initiative, and these are the folks listed who are the real experts in this. And Joel and I joined them about a year ago to introduce the role of metrics in their work. So we owe a lot to them for setting all this up and giving us a lot of advice and so forth. Okay, so first of all, I don't think this really needs stressing because we've already heard several talks on information assurance. Cyber threats are a serious risk. If you think about what could be possible, it could be as bad as loss of mission. If a sufficiently motivated adversary wanted to do it, they probably could. Now, estimating the likelihood, I have no idea how to do that, but just the possibility that someone or some set of people, if sufficiently motivated and funded, might be able to do this, I think should be a big cause for concern. So that's sort of the underlying assumption, and I hope that the audience here will agree that we at least ought to be looking at cybersecurity, and we've already heard about it too. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on in this talk is you're facing a decision. You're contemplating introducing some sort of defense into a flight project environment against to close some cyber vulnerability. And there's a question whether or not you ought to introduce that defense. And it might sound like a silly question. Why would you not want to introduce a defense to a cyber vulnerability? Well, we'll get to that. In very brief, what Joel and I, with help from Joy, established was an adaptation of a traditional V&V workflow to assess that defense. And in the course of doing so, we had to figure out what metrics to collect, how to analyze those, how to present them, the purpose of which is to inform that deployment decision. So as I said, this is in the context of JPL's Cyber Defense Research Initiative, which the big aim of which is to develop a cyber defense research laboratory. And this is their goal, to develop, evaluate, and validate cyber defense architectures and mitigations for JPL missions in a controlled environment and in the presence of attacks. So what they're trying to do in the second statement here is essentially develop a safe sandbox computing environment in which you can run tests and experiments without worry of damaging production operation systems. So this at an abstract level is the things you have to take into account when you're making a deployment decision. What will the costs be? What will the benefits be? And what, if any, risks will actually introducing that defense introduce? And it's a decision, and you have to do some trade-offs because things will cost. You have limited resources, whether the cost is worth the benefit, whether the additional risk is outweighed by the benefit. You have to take all those considerations into account. So costs are not just monetary. They are a concern. So if for example, you have to purchase some commercial tool, you have to think about what it costs to pay for the license fees, what it costs to maintain and install that, whether there's going to be training, a help desk, sysadmin, and so forth, what it costs to train your users to work in the context of that system. So there are the budgetary costs, of course, but there are also other costs which affect operational environments, especially computational. Is the defense going to chew up CPU resources that they desperately need? Is it going to use up memory, file space, network bandwidth? And how much it uses and how acceptable that is will depend on how much is available. So if you're close to your limit on any of those, you can barely afford anything more. And then a third category is, and a very serious concern for operational environments, is what about the inconvenience that the defense might add to the people trying to operate in this environment? Will it force them to take extra steps, like log in every time they start a new program? Will it actually cut down on the things they can do, make it less usable, actually turn things off that they were relying upon? Will it get in their way? Will it cause interruptions? So we heard in the previous panel, there's this big issue with static analysis of false positives, false alarms. So if you've got some sort of defense that is issuing on the fly warnings to users, but those turn out to be false alarms, that's very objectionable. And after a while, they'll just ignore everything, and you've lost the whole benefit of the defense then. So you have to consider what kinds of user inconvenience it might cause as well. Now, in terms of the benefits, presumably the reason you're considering some sort of defense is it gives you some sort of protection. So if we think about the three main categories of cyber threats, you might be trying to prevent them, so just stop them dead so they don't even begin to happen. You might be trying to detect that one is ongoing and presumably then respond to it in some fashion. So it might be that it starts. You can't prevent it from starting, but you can detect when it's happening and stop it from progressing too far. Or it might be a recovery kind of defense where if an attack has taken place, what can you have done in advance to make it easier to recover from that situation? And all of them might also do some logging for future forensics. So people can come in and say, how did that happen? Or are we seeing this thing more and more often? Should we do something about it? So you want to think about, from the benefits perspective, which of these areas is it helping you in? And it might also, you might be focused on closing some kind of vulnerabilities, but as a side effect, it might close additional ones. So there might be additional security that you can think of as another positive for adopting the defense. In terms of evaluation, especially for like we heard in the panel, evaluation of static analysis tools, they have false positives and false negatives. So you might want to evaluate, is that ratio good for our project? Is that acceptable? If it's a detection kind of thing where it detects the attack after it's begun, how quickly does it detect the attack? How much can it stop the attack before the attack has progressed too far? So these are the kinds of things you could measure in terms of how efficient the defense is. How many times does it actually detect that kind of attack? And then there might be additional benefits which are not necessarily cybersecurity benefits, but just help your environment anyway. So if your defense involves closing down unnecessary processes that would be a vulnerability if left running, but are unnecessary in some strict sense, then just closing them down not only closes that vulnerability, but it also maybe leads to faster processing for the people who are running legitimate jobs on your machines. So sometimes there are benefits for the regular computing milieu as well as for the cybersecurity. There is the possibility that introducing a defense actually introduces new or increases new vulnerabilities. You'll see an example of that later on. It could be possible that one kind of defense actually interferes with or undermines another kind of defense. So you have to at least think of that when you're considering these things. And a tricky one is when you're thinking of normal operation, like the day-to-day development environment where people have not a lot of time, but they're not under time-critical pressure, then the minor inconvenience of a defense having to do an extra login step or whatever might seem to be trivial. But if it's under some unusual situation, like they're trying to respond to an on-orbit anomaly and they're under time pressure and it's 3 in the morning, they can't call up the help desk to reset their password, what might be a minor inconvenience in other situations could be a major impediment. So you have to think through those off-nominal conditions as well and think, do I really want that defense running during those conditions? So to get back to some of the motivation for the team, they wanted to set up a sandboxed environment because you think, well, why not just put the defense into the operational environment and see how it does? You could actually put it into the operational environment and deliberately try and attack it with malicious software and see how well it does defending it. Now that would be a big mistake for many reasons. If it failed to defend against the attack, you've then severely disrupted the operational environment. So here I have this like iconic picture of a photo of the JPL operations room and these little demons running away once you've let them loose. So you would not want to do that. More mundanely, even if you don't actually try attacking in the operational environment, if the defense itself is disruptive, you may be interfering with their ongoing work. So you don't want to just blindly introduce the thing into the operational environment. Instead, it's like the way they handle lunar samples. They handled them very carefully when they first got them in very well-contained conditions. Same thing for these cyber defenses and the attacks you might throw against them. That's why you like to have some sort of test bed where it's safe to do experiments. You can test it over and over again in a repeatable fashion. You can measure it, how much it cost in terms of those resource usages and so forth. You can measure its benefits, how quickly it addressed the threats. And you can measure whether it introduced additional vulnerabilities, all safely because you're doing it in your own kind of sandbox. You're not interfering with ongoing operations. There's no worry about the malware you threw against it escaping out into the rest of the institution, or worse yet, the internet, and everyone blaming your institution for this. So there's a lot of advantages to having a sandboxed environment. But there is a question of fidelity. We're always told, fly like you test like you fly. So you'd like to test these things in as a realistic an environment as possible, but that's not always possible to make it perfectly realistic. And there are these things that are often called confounders of test fidelity. So you might, in your sandboxed environment, have fewer machines, fewer processors, fewer routers, and so forth. So you're operating in a cut-down situation. You have fewer real users, fewer of the applications they would normally be running. Maybe you don't have real users telling you how they really use the system. They just give you some guidance of how they might. You can probably only afford to do tests for a short duration, so you might not catch long-lived effects. Same situation in testing of software normally. Specifically for cybersecurity, you might not have all the network connectivity you would normally have. You might not have all the firewalls. You might not have two-factor authentication, and so forth. And it's very common in these cyber test beds to use virtualization, to be able to virtually create multiple machines, so you can simulate distributed denial of service, for example. But virtualization itself is not a perfect recreation of the real world, and it might not be reflective of what really happens. So all of these things, you might be doing these testing in a sandboxed environment, but you have to worry, do the results I get from testing there carry over into what would happen if I put this into the operational environment? So we make the analogy with space testing. There's a quote here from a fairly recent paper that the lunar environment cannot be sufficiently emulated on Earth. Therefore, system verification testing will rely to some extent on extension by analysis and ultimate testing in the field. And that's what we're doing here. We're going to show you how we've done testing in a sandbox environment, how we try to extrapolate those results to say what we think would happen in the real operational situation. And if we get confidence from that, then we would go ahead and carefully actually deploy it into operations. Maybe we would do that for a probationary period. Maybe we would keep watching it sometime longer. But we do all this very carefully. Okay, so Joel and I came up with a workflow which has these basic steps, very straightforward. First of all, if you're doing this in a sandbox test environment, you have to set the thing up to mimic the system you're trying to model. Then you put the attack into that. So if the purpose of the defense is to defend against a certain kind of attack, first of all, you put the attack in that test environment and make sure it works. because until you can show the attack works, you can't show the defense prevented the attack. Sounds trivial, but you have to do that. And as you're doing so, you can also measure how effective that attack was, how much data it gathered, how far it got, things like that. Then in the third step, the defense step, you actually put the defense, you develop it, pick it, whatever, put it into that test environment, take measurements without the attack to see just how disruptive the thing would be without any attack whatsoever. Is the defense consuming too much CPU? Once you're happy with the defense on its own, then you put in the attack and see how well the defense does preventing or detecting or cleaning up afterwards, whatever kind of defense it is. You measure how effective the defense was. And you talk to real users at that point. You say, well, these are the measurements we took in this environment. Here's how we think they would extrapolate to your operational environment. Do you think that's okay? And they might tell you, no, that's not okay, in which case you go back and revise your defense. Or they might say, yeah, looks all right. So then you would carefully progress to the validate step, where you actually put the thing in the real operational environment. And it's interesting, there was a discussion in the panel, or questions, were they focusing on essentially just the code, the flight code that would be flown or used in operations, or were they also looking at the development environment? Well, this talk is focused on work that looks at all three, at the development environment, the operations environment, the people who are preparing commands for spacecraft, and for the code itself. You could put flight code into a simulated environment and throw malware against it and see whether it protects it. So we actually do explicitly aim this thing to include development, people who are actually developing code, testing code, people who are developing spacecraft commands, sending those to the spacecraft, and the code itself that will actually be on the spacecraft. So anyway, so the validate step is where you actually put it in to whatever your real operational environment is in a careful manner, hopefully reversibly, so if things go wrong, you can back out from that mistake. And once you're really happy with all that, then you essentially commit to deploying it for regular everyday use. So I think at this point, a running example probably will help, because I've talked in the abstract. So I'm going to give an example that the cyber defense research folks had already developed and talked about. It's what they call the reconnaissance attack. This gives the citation for their publication where you can read more about it. And this is a picture which I'll step through on what this reconnaissance attack is. And they use this as an illustration in JPL to draw attention to the need for a cybersecurity test bed and research of this nature. Okay, so the initial assumption is that a breach has occurred during which time an adversary, the attacker, has had brief access to some legitimate user's home directory. Now you might question, well, that could never happen. We've got firewalls, we've got passwords. There are lots of ways it could happen. So just trust me that this is a very plausible assumption that an adversary could have got access for a short amount of time to someone's home directory. And in this reconnaissance attack that our colleagues developed, they assumed that in that brief amount of time, the attacker added a few lines to that legitimate user's login script. Those few lines will do two things. They'll start, whenever the user logs in, their login script runs, of course. And these extra lines do two things. They start an xterm, which will display on the attacker's machine. So the attacker might be somewhere else in a different country, just sat there at his or her machine, having planted this malicious code in the user's login directory. When the user logs in, a window is going to open on the attacker's machine, which will let the attacker operate as if he or she were the user on whatever machine the user is logged into. The second thing that these folks thought was there could be a second thing. There's this Linux command xkbits, which is essentially another X term, but what it does is it's usually used for assistance or training purposes. So both sides of both viewers can essentially see what each other is doing. So this lets the attacker see everything the user is doing. So now the attacker has two windows on their machine, one which watches everything the user does, the other the attacker can use to execute any command the user is allowed to execute. So this is pretty bad. So this is the step where the attacker's machine now has those two windows, which I just talked about. Let's suppose the user within the corporate network has now logged into the next machine. And it might be the case that once they've logged into the first one using two-factor authentication, they don't have to repeat that while they're in the same kind of network environment. But the attacker now has access to that machine too. Another point about this is these two windows that the attacker has, when the xkbits one, the xkbits one is the one which is watching everything the user does. So when the user logs off, that window goes away. But the X term, which allows the attacker to operate as the user, stays there. When the original user is logged off, the attacker is still logged into whatever machine the user is logged into. It can still continue to execute commands, even though the original user has gone home for the night or whatever. So that's pretty bad. Now, it might be the case that there's what's labeled here as a bastion between the environment where people may be developing commands for spacecraft and the actually very carefully protected network where they issue those commands. And the user probably would have to do a second login to get across into that more protected environment on the right. So the attacker might not actually be able to log in there because the attacker doesn't have the little token that has the two-factor numbers in it. But the attacker can still see what the user is doing. So this is still pretty bad. And it might be that the user has prepared commands in the corporate network to be radiated to the spacecraft and then steps over into the flight operations network and sends those commands. If while the user was developing those commands at the left-hand side, the attacker disrupted them, put in some malicious command code, now the user unknowingly goes ahead into the secure environment, sends those up to the spacecraft. So this is a pretty scary scenario. One more thing, what our colleagues did when they demonstrated this, they showed that there are actually symptoms that are detectable of this kind of attack. You can see that there's an X term going out somewhere else where it presumably shouldn't go. And you can see when the user logs off, you can see there's still a process running, which is this xkbits thing, that is also dubious as well. So there are ways of writing detection rules that can see those things happening. Okay, so using that example, I'm going to step through the workflow that Joel and I established and show you how Joey helped us in the course of this. So first of all is a setup step where you have to set up the sandbox to mimic whatever you think is important about your environment. So first of all, what we're concerned with is confidentiality and integrity. We don't want attackers to be reading spacecraft designs, command control information. We certainly don't want them to interfere with that by changing commands maliciously. So the attack we're trying to defend against is this reconnaissance attack. And you have to question, is this a realistic attack? Could it happen in the real world, or is this just a made-up example? You could test it. You could actually make the initial assumption of a breach, put in some the additional scripting lines in the login, and show that it can happen. What's known is that this kind of attack has been seen in the wild. There is evidence that it has happened in other institutions. So it's a very plausible attack to want to defend against. So given all that, it's worthwhile to go ahead and consider defending against it. But the last thing in the setup step is our colleagues developed a test environment where they put in some number of CPUs, not as many as there are in the real operational environment. They put in a little subnetwork, they put in authentication services and so forth, which they thought were relevant to this scenario. And for our work, we got them to simplify it even further. So we worked entirely in virtual machines running on a laptop, and we threw out what we thought were irrelevant services to what we were going to focus on, like authentication, which might be a point of debate. But that's what we did. We simplified. So we got through this setup stage. And now, in the attack stage, we have to determine, does the attack work without the defense in the test environment? So yes, you can run it, put in the script lines in the user's login, have the user log in, see that the terminals appear on the attacker's machine. You can trivially measure how bad it is because everything the user does, the attacker can see. The attacker can perform commands as if he or she were the user. You can check that that happens too. You could also argue that this could be a threat to availability, because if the attacker has the ability to issue commands, they could do a denial of service attack. That, yeah, we kind of ignored that. But it's a plausible additional aspect of this attack. Okay, so here's actually a screenshot. So this is actually on my PC. So the black window is the victim logged into the virtual machine. The green window is the attacker's kibitz window, which lets the attacker see everything the user does. And the red window is the attacker's extern window, which lets the attacker do anything they like as if they were logged in as the user. And you can't see the details, but I put in a mock example where the attacker has done a file listing of one of the user's files to just show that it was possible. And the user has done a directory listing, which the attacker sees the exactly same thing. So it's trivial to see that this attack succeeds running in this virtual environment. Okay, so the defense step, again, employed in this virtual test environment. Our colleagues had put into their virtualization a commercial network monitoring system. They didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so they have this commercial network monitoring system, and they'd built the queries specific to this to detect these kind of X terms. And what we did, we added an automated response to kill those processes that were displaying on the attacker's machine. So we have monitoring. The monitoring detects the symptoms of the attack. It triggers our script. Our script kills the rogue processes. First of all, we take measurements when there's no attack running to understand what's the cost of this monitoring, basically. How much CPU does it use? How much memory does it take? And so forth. And then we take costs. When the attack is running, does it work? Does it actually detect the windows and processes and kill them? How quickly does it do so? I have these black cat and white cat icons. That's like the black hat and white hat in cybersecurity. Okay, so here's actually, so literally, first we would get these things running when we have these green and red windows pop up. And we would sit there with a stopwatch and measure how long it took for the monitoring system to recognize this attack was occurring, trigger the script, and the script kill the attacker's processes, in which point those windows would disappear. So it would just literally sit there by hand and time it. And it worked. It worked in like tens of seconds, sometimes less than 10 seconds. At that point, we were ready to move to the verify step, which is where you begin to talk to the real users on the results you've gathered so far. And as you do so, you have to think, well, we measured this in a virtual environment on a PC or a Macintosh. What does that mean if it were operating on the real environment? So you have to do some extrapolation here. And when you do this, you sort of together with the real users, you together try and extrapolate to what you all think it would do. And then the real users have to make an assessment. Is that good enough? Am I happy with with that amount of CPU usage, I'm happy with the time it takes to kill those processes. And if they say yes, then you're ready to go ahead to the next step. If they say no, you have to go back and revisit your defense based on the ways they told you they were not satisfied with it. Okay, so here's in the numbers you can see the kind of log files we capture, and we found it was useless to just show those log files to the real users. I mean, they didn't even want to spend the time looking at them. So yeah, you can capture these measurements in log files, but you better find a way of showing the information to people. And this is where Joey came in. Joey has an interest in cybersecurity and in mobile applications. And so what he developed for us was, well, you get an entire dashboard, including several key visualizations. So here's one of his visualizations, fairly straightforward. The horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis is the amount of the CPU that is being consumed. And there are two lines on this. The orange line is the total CPU usage, so everything that is running on this virtual CPU. The height of the orange line is that proportion of the CPU, so it gets up to about 40%. The little blue line at the bottom is how much of that CPU was used by the monitoring process itself. So this is the process that is at periodic intervals looking for symptoms of the attack and triggering the script accordingly. And as you can see, the blue line is trivially small. There's plenty of unused CPU capacity. So in that respect, just running the defense is perfectly acceptable. There's nothing bad happening in terms of CPU utilization. Now you might say, well, that's fine. You had one user on one virtual CPU. Measurement was fine. What happens when you have 50 users on their network of machines? What would happen then? Well, actually, the way our colleagues had architected the defense is they assumed there'd be one single central machine that is gathering the data from all the different machines. And that central machine would do the hard duty processing to recognize symptoms of the attack. All the users' machines would have to do is forward information from their individual machine. So this thing scales very nicely from the point of view of the individual users. They're not affected as more users get added to the network. Their own machine doesn't slow down. So in that respect, it scales very nicely. And the assumption is you put whatever processing power is needed on that central machine. So in terms of extrapolating CPU usage from the user's point of view, everything good. So far, so good. Another thing is, okay, it's supposed to detect and respond and kill these attacks. How quickly does it do so? So here's one where this chart shows a whole bunch of attacks. We got fed up on these very long experiments, and we decided to just start these attacks over and over and over again at like 10, 15-second intervals. And so each line segment shows the period during which an attack is operating. So this means we'd started one of these evil X terms somewhere else. That's the beginning of a colored line segment. And the end of that line segment is when the detection, response, and process killing had done its work and the X term goes away. So you can see they're all pretty brief. I showed you one outline that's about 28 seconds. And then we computed a histogram which showed that in a few cases they got up to close to 50 seconds, but that was the maximum we saw. Generally, they're kind of in the 10 to 30 second range durations. So that's not perfect, but that's probably pretty good. The attacker is not going to be able to do much in 10 to 30 seconds. So that was our measurement of how effective the defense was in terms of the speed at which it would close off the attack. We also did these same experiments in different load conditions. The top right is the one you already saw with the orange and blue lines. That was when the total CPU load from everything on that machine was pretty benign. The bottom left is where we deliberately loaded up the machine with extra processing. And And sure, the extra processing is consuming a lot of CPU, but the blue line is still trivial. And more importantly, it didn't seem to affect very much the speed of the response. Things were slightly slower. We saw about a 1 second slowdown on average, but that was it. So it seems to be just almost as effective under high load conditions as low load. Okay, so Joey built this whole thing. He built a whole metrics dashboard. So the idea is you could at one glance see these graphs of load and network traffic and vulnerability windows. You could see some summary statistics telling you the maximum CPU usage of everything, the maximum CPU usage of the monitoring, and so forth. You can put up these histograms that we generate. And then there's a slider. So these are actually graphs for experiments that last a lot longer than the window you see right here. You can use the slider to go back and forth and just inspect the whole thing. And this is actually a mock-up. I don't have an iPad. I have a PC, so I was unable to actually recreate his screen on a real iPad. So I just took the screenshot and put it. This is what it would look like on Joey's iPad. And the idea is of putting on an iPad is you can go and show it to the users right in front of them. You don't have to make them come to your office or arrange a meeting. You can just catch them anytime. Okay, so thinking about the V&V workflow, now you have to get into the verify. What about the cost? Because if you're putting this thing in the real operational environment, and it's a commercial network monitoring system, there are probably license costs for that. You have to pay for maybe a dedicated machine to run the thing. And if this were the only attack that you were defending against, it might not be worth it. But if you can argue there are many other uses for that kind of monitoring capability, that you can amortize its cost over all those situations. And it seems pretty reasonable to argue why this is the way to go. Certainly, you don't want to rebuild your own network monitoring system. However, there is one really serious disadvantage, at least one serious disadvantage to the naive defense we came up with. It's that now users cannot ever open an XTerm onto a different machine. Even if they wanted to, they would open it, it would open, but a few seconds later it would get killed off. So if you're trying to get your help from your colleague across the town or whatever, and you're trying to open an XTerm on their machine, you can't do it. So the users told us this is completely unacceptable. There's no way we would allow this thing. Another thing that turned out to be a problem in the naive way, or simple way we've done it, in order to kill the rogue processes, remember the architecture, the user's machine forwards information to the central machine, which does the analysis to recognize these rogue processes. The central machine then runs a script to kill the rogue processes which are back on the user's machine. In order to do that, it has to have the authority from one machine to kill something running on another machine. So the naive way I programmed that for these experiments was I used passwordless secure shell. So the central machine, I gave it the authority to execute any command it liked on the user's machine, and I used that authority to have it kill the rogue processes. And this, all the cyber folks immediately told me, this is a big violation of the least privilege. You're giving far too much privilege to this process over there to have far more capability than it needs. All it needs to do is kill a rogue process, not have the authority to execute anything it likes. So clearly that's a serious risk. So here's a way of kind of summarizing the status of what we learned from these experiments. So this is a typical radar chart where each of the radial lines is a different axis of consideration. Dollars, CPU, memory, bandwidth, those are the kind of computer resource, well, budgetary and computer resources. Convenience, further out, the more convenient it is, further in, the more inconvenient it is. These two axes for the defense, since this is supposed to be protecting confidentiality and integrity, how well does it do at defending those? And then risk is, does it actually introduce any additional risks? And I claimed earlier that the cost, if you can argue it can be amortized, paying for this network monitoring thing, is reasonable. Certainly we saw from the data and the plausible extrapolation that the CPU, memory, and bandwidth were consumed by it were utterly trivial on the user's machines. However, the user's convenience, it was unacceptable. It was just not going to be allowed into the operational environment as is. In terms of defense, it was pretty good. You know, as I said, we measured between typically 10 to 30 seconds was the period during which the attacker would have these windows open and then they disappear. I should say it also did logging as well. So if people wanted to see how many times this thing was happening, they would have the logs keeping track of that. Then the risk axis was the one, because it used passwordless SSH, it was this violation of least privilege. So that was unacceptable too. So if this were our workflow, if we were doing this for more than just an example, at that point we'd have to go back and rethink the defense. So we've gone somewhere in this respect. So the first obvious thing is to deal with the inconvenience, you allow the user to whitelist other destinations to which X-terms are allowed to go. This is still somewhat inconvenient because now the user has to know to do this. They have to remember how to do it. They have to remember how to do it at 3 a.m. when they're trying to correct an urgent bug and so forth. But at least they can do it. So maybe that's tolerable, maybe not. So you've probably improved on the convenience access by allowing users to explicitly whitelist places where X-terms are allowed to go. Anything not in that list, the defense will kill them off. It hasn't changed the confidentiality or integrity. The other thing you can do is, instead of using this passwordless SSH, you could have a much more specific signal whose only purpose was to tell the user's machine, kill that process. And if you did that, then it would probably become acceptable from the risk perspective. But there is still this question of convenience. Do you really want users to have to be trained on this whitelisting? Are they going to accept it? And some user communities, maybe they will, some maybe not. So a third consideration is, supposing instead of having the script just automatically kill these rogue processes, have it send a notification to the user's phone. So you're the user, you're sat there logged on your machine, and suddenly your phone goes beep, 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 or whatever obnoxious noise it makes. And you look at this thing that says, do you know you've got an X-term process on this IP address in China? And presumably the user then would do something like go into their machine and kill that process and so forth. So the risk introduced by this is real low. All you're doing is sending a notification to the user's phone. You're not killing any processes. So on the risk axis, the introduced risk is almost zero. In terms of convenience, it's up to the user. They can look at that phone message, they can ignore it, they can maybe whitelist that address. Yeah, that one's okay, that's my colleague across town. So they could still have a whitelisting which would let them turn off these obnoxious notifications when they were okay, but still be there when they were real alerts. However, it does decrease the defense some, because now the response is no longer automatic. So there's a time delay. The user has to actually pick up their phone, read the message, do something about it. So the defense is not as good. So if you were to look at this, the defense would shift down closer to the sort of yellow ring, which is mediocre. So if you'd done that, maybe you'd be happy with it, maybe not. So supposing you'd got this thing developed, you were pretty happy with it, maybe that last one I described, and you're ready to put it into the operational environment. Here, as the sign says, proceed with caution. Don't just stick it in and hope that it works right. Be willing to tolerate some disruption in that environment if the defense itself just goes wrong, let alone without an attack. If it's safe to do so, once you're happy with the defense on its own, if it's safe to do so, then try the attack. And you better be ready to address, if the defense fails to stop that attack, you better have a way to recover from that situation. And then, if all that appears acceptable, then you can actually go ahead and deploy the thing for real, for normal operation. If it was not acceptable, you sort of have to figure out the root cause. Why did I not figure out this thing was not going to be acceptable? Certainly, you're going to have to, at the very least, go back and redesign the defense to make it acceptable. But in order to know how to redesign it, you have to understand what was wrong in your extrapolation. So it should give you clues as to what was I not understanding about the user's environment. What did I not put in the original setup that was actually a critical factor in sufficiently recreating the fidelity of this defense? And it's not easy to do that. And there's this quote, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. It's difficult to actually find the right attribution for that quote. Anyway, but extrapolation is not easy, so even the deploy step have to be ready for going back. When you do get to deploy, maybe you do it for a probationary period. So you let the thing run while you're continuing to be very careful, have backups for things. You're doing it during a non-critical period of operations, let's say, or when people are not as busy as they could be, so that they can tolerate disruptions. You might pick a subset of your user community. Say, I'm just gonna try this out on these users over here, our guinea pigs, and the rest of the folks, we'll leave them be until we're really sure from our early adopters that they're happy with it. And even once you've sort of let this thing loose as a regular day-to-day defense, you might want to keep watching it because there might be assumptions that underpinned its design that gradually degrade. You know, things might change that might cause you to want to revisit, is that the right kind of defense? Okay, so just to recap, I'm getting close to the end here. The purpose was to inform a decision whether or not to deploy a certain kind of defense to a cyber vulnerability. Our colleagues had developed this sandboxed environment where it's safe to do experiments. When you're doing those experiments, you have to measure things like costs, budgetary, resources, and so forth. You have to figure out the benefits, so you can do the cost-benefit trade-off. You have to also be alert to new risks that you might have introduced. All this is challenging because the sandboxed environment will inevitably be a simplification of the real one. And that's why we came up with this organized workflow to step through in a very disciplined way so that the project people will say, yeah, you did a good job. We're going to let you go ahead to the next step and so forth. We found with help from Joy that visualization really helped present the results rather than just showing boring log files that no one wants to look at. And then we came up with a way of maybe visually using these radar charts, showing the status of one defense versus another. Okay, there are some things that tripped us up along the way. One is we acknowledge that when we did it in our virtualization on the PC and on the Mac, we did not have many of the features that are present in the real environment. We didn't recreate the entire two-factor authentication system in our virtual environment. Another thing that got us was actually I took the script that our colleagues had worked for detecting the attack. When they did these demonstrations, they'd scripted this thing using this network monitoring system to detect the attack. And there was some subtle feature that over a long period of time, well, actually over a repetition of many attacks, there were certain attacks that escaped notification, purely because I'd naively reused a script that they'd only written for demonstration purposes, for like one-off demonstrations. I'd just taken it as is and used it in repetitions of experiments. So that was more my fault, but it does point out that you have to be careful when you're doing these things, like any kind of software development. What we like to do is actually take some of our ideas, especially maybe the phone notification one, which is probably the most plausible one to get into a JPL flight environment. People will probably accept that, but they're very suspicious of anything that's going to automatically kill processes, perhaps rightfully so. What we would like to do is actually develop that, get it employed, maybe for future environments, projects which aren't yet flying, they might agree to more automation. So there may be a distinction between people who are already set in their ways, don't want any disruption whatsoever, you have less capability to introduce automated defenses. But something that's more just a notification, perhaps that's acceptable. But for the future, maybe they'll be more willing to buy into it from the beginning. And we'd, of course, like to repeat this process on a much wider range of attacks and defenses, not just this reconnaissance attack. And as we do so, we see the need for building a library of ways to measure, how to take measurements in these virtualized environments, and ways of introducing artificial load. So we don't want to keep re-scripting the same things. Okay, my last slide. There are some global issues that Joel, Joy, and I didn't address in our portion of the work. The configuration of the test environment is a lot harder than you might suspect. For example, our colleagues, when they virtualized the recon demo, they struggled with two-factor authentication because it turns out that bringing that capability into a sandboxed environment. So what you don't want to do is have your sandboxed environment have a connection to the real world, like for two-factor authentication, because that connection is exposing your environment where you've maybe put malware. It's exposing that to the real world. So, so actually bringing in as much as you need of the real world is not trivial, as we've heard from them. An interesting thing. Supposing you do some testing of somebody's piece of code or their network environment, and you find a list of vulnerabilities. That list is itself sensitive data. You probably don't want to email that thing in plain text, right? Because you've now just emailed something which is a perfect guide to a malicious attacker on where to attack the system. So it's an interesting thing that how you deal with just the data you gather from these is a question people need to pay attention to. You need protocols for doing testing to keep it safe, to make it repeatable, to know how to wipe out the machines so that when you put, let's say you've done a test where you've put deliberately malicious malware, which you can get a hold of, into your sandboxed environment, done things, how do you make sure when you finish that test, you can clean out that malware and it not have any lingering nastiness to get you the next time, or when you plug in your USB stick or whatever. And that's not trivial either. And just to point that out, you might think, oh, you're running all this in a virtualized thing, so the malware can't escape from that virtual environment. That's not true. There's malware that can tell when it's running in a virtualized environment and behave differently. It can decide not to do its thing, so you might be testing it and everything looks fine, but when you put it in a non-virtualized environment, it says, aha, now I'm going to do my thing. There's other malware which can actually attack the virtualization itself, the hypervisor. So all these things I learned talking to the cyber folks. Before I talked to them, I used to have dark hair, but it's so scary, and there's just so many ways these things can be attacked. And then there are these major challenges. I'm sure you've seen these messages. You get this information that this file might be unsafe. Well, can you put numbers on that, like 20% unsafe? So assessing cyber risk in general terms is really hard. And that also relates to, okay, you've put in this defense for this particular step of an attack. How much does that improve your overall risk situation? Assessing the benefit of that in the grand scheme of things is another big concern, not just for us. I think that's a challenge for the cyber community at large. And that's my last slide. Thank you. And welcome questions if there's time. Yeah, you go.
Just a quick comment. I did like your communication with the users there, where you had the log files and you were showing it to them, and it just wasn't making sense. You said, let me bring somebody in and let's get this on a graph so you understand it. And what I've seen is that's just so important across the board, to get them on the same page. And when you see them nodding off, because they may be disinterested, but they won't tell you they're disinterested.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So I thought that was great.
Yeah, it actually helped us. I mean, and until we'd looked at the log files, but until we saw them graphed like that, we didn't really understand. And we still have some questions like, why are those blips in there? But yeah, visualization is very helpful. I'm actually a big fan of information visualization, even though I only use very naive or
Sometimes the simple, naive ones work the best.
Yeah, yeah.
Hi. On slide 8, you showed three approaches to your defense, which was detection, prevention, and recovery. Well, to recover, you have to have detected it first, right? So what's the distinction between those two?
Slide 8? Yeah. Good memory. No, that's slide 8. That's slide 7. That's slide 9. That's slide 8. Yeah, okay. So recovery, that's more things like if you've kept secure backups on different machines. So it might be a cyber attack has gone in and destroyed, deleted files of yours. But a simple form of recovery would just be to have some way of bringing that information back. And that's the kind of thing that's done anyway, regardless of cyber attacks. People keep duplicate copies of critical code and so forth. And in California, we keep them in separate physical locations because of earthquakes. But yeah, recovery in terms of not just data, but recovering the capability. So let's say it's a denial of service attack while you're issuing some critical commands to the ISS or whatever. What you might need to be prepared to do is cut your control environment off from the entire internet in order that you can now get back your ability to command or send information to the ISS. Forget the fact that you're going to talk to the outside world for a while just to prevent this distributed denial of service attack. So it might be that you can't necessarily guarantee to stop those attacks, but if they happen at the worst possible time, you ought to have a backup plan in mind. What will you do to recover? And there what you need to recover is the capability to send information. It's not data recovery, it's sort of information conveyance recovery. So the kind of attack and what recovery means are coupled. So these things have all sorts of variations depending on what you're concerned about and what the attack could do, what you can do in response.
Just to piggyback on, and I'm glad he brought that up, I'm a little bit further downstream with the users, but we have that regularly in my work with the disaster recovery backup. I'll come in, oh, we're backed up, we're backed up. Well, what do you have? Is it files backed up? Is the application backed up? Did you do a full Windows, backup? And it's again, communicating with the users where they think they might have something, but being further involved with the IT and the technology, what they have might not be exactly what they have or what they need. So it's important for us, like you said, have that critical line of code to be telling them what they really need. Because sometimes there's, again, that little communication void, and that could cause big problems up the road. Thank you.
Yeah, we've actually had, for regular software development, we have people do backups, and we also once in a while test that they can restore from the backup. So we don't want the backup to be write only. Yeah. Thank you.